patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 131 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Talosky. Thank you all so much for joining me for this Sacred Honor Series episode. We are continuing the New Jersey delegation with John Hart. Before we get to our episode, as always, a big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. If you'd like to join, you can check the link down in the show notes below, and if you donate $10 or more, you will get a complimentary Friends and Fellow Citizens mug. We are working hard to try and get the next batch, so make sure to check out that Patreon link. Also, if you haven't already, if you're enjoying this podcast, make sure to subscribe to the show and to our email list so you can get notifications. We are doing some work on redoing the email list, something that's a bit more consolidated, more details, perhaps later this year or early next year, 2024. So today's episode is about John Hart, next signer of the Declaration of Independence, once again from the colony of New Jersey. John Hart's birth year is a bit hard to determine, according to certain biographers. Some people say 1713, so we'll just go with that. John Hart, born in 1713, and his education was not formal. Unlike some of the signers who did have formal education, Hart did not. And that didn't really deter him, though, because he was someone who was very well regarded in his circle, and certainly it really paid off with the kinds of work that he did for his home colony and eventually home state. Hart married a woman named Deborah Scudder. She was born in 1739. Apparently, what I read from one of these sites here, from the Descendants of the Signers of the Declaration of Independence site, is that he actually rode 30 miles round trip to woo Deborah, which is quite amazing. Wish that sort of courting could happen nowadays. Someone driving for hours to court someone. Maybe that's true somewhere out there in this world. They eventually have 13 children, which, as anyone will probably know, that's quite a few kids to worry about. And it's remarkable, just as a side note, of how a lot of these signers really maintained those connections with their family when they were away. And now I know New Jersey is not too far from D.C., at least nowadays, but of course at that time, that was still a bit of a considerable distance, and people still corresponded with letters. Just to kind of recognize that a number of these signers really came from long distances, but also have very, very large families. So you can imagine how huge the role was, not only of the signers, but also of their spouses and the rest of their family. So Hart acquired 600 acres in Hopewell, New Jersey, which is still around today. The town is still there. The specific plot of land I don't think is around anymore, not that I know of. But his career really was into public service, but really he had a lot of insight into farming and business. With that 600 acres, he was able to have a lot of livestock and crops. He did have 4 slaves, which was maybe a bit rarer for the northern part of the country, but nonetheless, it was still part of just life at the time, specifically for much of the wealthy. He entered public service in 1750. And he acquired a lot of different roles. So once again, just like with Francis Hopkinson, the previous signer from New Jersey, I'm not going to go through every single position that he had because that would take forever. But nonetheless, he was selected in 1776 to the New Jersey Provincial Congress, and eventually was chosen as one of the delegates to the Second Continental Congress. Now, something that I have not mentioned so far with the New Jersey delegation is that apparently the previous delegates, so not the ones that we have covered or are going to cover for in the series, but there was there were delegates before who did not support independence. And I don't know what those mechanisms were when it came to the swapping of delegates, but eventually all those delegates were gone. So, it's not surprising because that fever was really spreading through the colonies, and it would just be kind of really embarrassing if New Jersey sent a bunch of delegates and they didn't support independence when they were talking about, a Declaration of Independence. Anyway, he was one of the 5 delegates. Again, we've covered 4 of them already. We got one more in December to cover. And he was very, very enthusiastic about supporting independence. There's no question about that. He put his name on there, and he was eventually selected in the following month of 1776 to be elected to the General Assembly in New Hampshire. And he was selected to be speaker, so honestly, very, very big role for him. Unfortunately, his dear wife, Deborah, passed away in October 1776, and I wonder if that was a big factor when it came to the later years of his life. As you'll hear, John Hart was one of those signers who unfortunately did not live very long after the signing of the Declaration. Hart still kept his job as speaker until 1778. What is interesting, again, from this really nice website, again, there's very limited information just generally about John Hart. However, one story goes is that his plantation and really him were targets by the British, given his relatively high role in society at the time. And so with the target in his back, Hart actually had to flee and run away from his own plantation and land. He hid in these mountains and these caves, and the British Army came in, and luckily there was some damage to his property, but it was not completely destroyed. Certainly this was not the case for some of these other signers, as we've already covered so far. Hart eventually was able to come back, but he wasn't finished with serving for his fellow patriots. In 1778, he actually worked with George Washington and the Continental Army, with about 12,000 people total. They actually camped on his field, so that must have been pretty interesting to talk with someone. Then next thing you know, 12,000 people are living on your land. But that was just the way things went. And Hart had quite a bit of features to help with just the providing resources for the Continental Army. And you would think, this is just a nice little campground, right? Well, it was actually a really good stop for Washington and the Army because soon after they left the plantation, the Continental Army fought the British at the Battle of Monmouth, also in New Jersey, and actually won. So Hart, I would say he should get some credit. If no historian is giving him credit, I disagree. I think he really played a good role in providing supplies and providing just not necessarily like weapons or ammunition, but just providing a safe place for these troops to rest before that big battle. Not to mention that recently, they just had the Battle of Trenton and Princeton, and so really, this idea of helping each other out with these causes and not knowing when that next threat is coming, that is so certainly, I think, a theme that we've seen over the course of the American Revolution. Now, I find that Hart would have wanted to really serve in a large number of roles. In particular, since he was coming from New Jersey, I think he would have been so instrumental in setting up what would be the state of New Jersey when it enters the Union. However, John Hart developed kidney stones in the 1778 or 1779, and he unfortunately could not recover, and he passes away on May 11th, 1779 at the age of 66. So he was older, but nonetheless, he only lived for just under 3 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I found the tributes to Mr. Hart quite interesting, and I would like to read a couple of these passages because I think there's some things to unpack here, some things that will be related to the closing remarks I have for this episode. The New Jersey Gazette wrote, quote, on Tuesday, the 11th instant, departed this life at his seat in Hopewell, John Hart, Esquire, the representative in General Assembly for the County of Hunterdon, and late Speaker of that House. He had served the Assembly for many years under the former government, taken an early and active part in the present revolution, and continued to the day he was seized with his last illness to discharge the duties of a faithful and upright patriot in his service in the service of his country in general and the county he represented. The universal approbation of his character and conduct among all ranks of people is the best testimony of his worth, and as it must make his death regretted and lamented, will ensure lasting respect to his memory. Now, an author named Cleon Hammond actually owned the Hart land in the 1950s. And here's a quote that he wrote in one of his books here. Quote, to look upon his gently sloping hillside, where the American army once camped, drink from his lusty old spring, and tread upon soil that was his, instilled a sense of identification with Mr. Hart that at times seemed very real. Far from a legend, he was a very human being, moved by the same forces that influence the lives and fortunes of all men. As one becomes acquainted with John Hart, there emerges a capable, personable, ambitious, yet dedicated man, essentially conservative, but heroically liberal. In his world, there were pioneers of land, of enterprise, and of political philosophy. From a good but modest beginning, John Hart embodied all three, and attainments qualify him unreservedly to be described as a self-made man in his time. Unquote. I think there's a lot to unpack for John Hart. Although his history is short, I find that there's some things that we can relate perhaps to this day and age. So the first takeaway I'd like to leave is we may never see the fruits of our labor of public service. Recently, I've had the opportunity to go to various political events around here in this Reno, Carson City area, and I was very, very touched to meet all these different kinds of people. Many of them were older people, but who said things I think were very, very important. They emphasized to me saying that young people really need to realize that a lot of what people are doing, especially a lot of these people who are part of the older generations, will never see the actual fruits of what they do. In fact, it really is going to affect the future generations. And I thought that was very interesting to hear because we often hear so much about how young people are just not involved in politics as much. Perhaps one of the reasons why, I'm not saying that it's necessarily justified or that it should remain the same this way. I do think that all different generations have different contributions to make to the political process. However, I believe one of the reasons why is because a lot of young people just simply don't understand the idea of leaving something for future generations. Maybe certain people are getting used to that, maybe learning how to start a family, really seeing how their children grow, and ultimately as they get older, then maybe they'll see their grandchildren get older and develop. But this is a part of, I think, of a natural process, I think. And I just relate this to our discussion for John Hart because it's knowing that some of these signers didn't even make it. I think it's so important we recognize the people who served for others, even knowing that they themselves were not going to recognize the fruits or not even see the fruits of their labor. That is why I think history is so important, because it's not to say that every part of history is perfect or good. It's the fact that there's still, despite all the craziness that's gone on in the history of this world, we can still know that there were people in the past who still served for others and didn't do so because they wanted to see something that they created and then go around and say, oh, look what an amazing job I did. I'm so great. I hope that the younger generations are grateful for what I did. That is not public service. Public service should be focusing on what you need to do. You certainly, I think, have to be a visionary, knowing that there are going to be things that are going to happen. Perhaps people nowadays might not see it. They might not see it for a long, long while, but you know that there's things that could be beneficial for your society. And those are things that people in public service need to think about. I certainly hope that that will be a priority for my generation, because ultimately any young generation is ultimately going to become the older generation. By recognizing that public service is a multi-generational effort, knowing that each generation is going to face its own unique challenges, I sincerely hope that more people can understand where certain generations are coming from when they debate politics or when they speak of another generation. It's not going to be easy. There's always going to be some kind of intergenerational conflict. But nonetheless, we can do better in at very minimum understanding people's perspectives, especially in an important area like public service. The next takeaway I have is nowadays, it seems like too many people, especially our people in leadership positions, not necessarily leaders, too many of them are self-proclaimed superheroes, but are not human. I bring this up because John Hart was known as Honest John. Kind of reminds you of Honest Abe as a nickname for Abraham Lincoln. I just hope that at some point, hopefully soon, that we will have new generations of leaders who know how to recognize that they themselves are human. I'm concerned that nowadays we're in an era where people are proclaiming that they know everything, or that they can do anything, or that anyone who disagrees with them is wrong. This toxic superhero feeling not only doesn't exist, but it creates a really bad image of public service. When I see a tweet from a member of Congress, and I don't go onto Twitter a lot, but when I see that the member of for whatever district is going around saying, I'm the only one who knows how to solve veterans affairs, or I'm the only one who knows how to build an economy. That's not true, though, is it? I mean, first of all, how can one person know how to build an economy when it requires multiple sectors of countless people, with countless leaders and countless others building a robust economy? You cannot just put yourself on a pedestal and just say that you know everything. Or veterans affairs. There's such a larger collective, and I'm shocked to see that these people in these leadership positions, and I distinguish these from leaders because leaders are ones who develop and who actually lead other people, not just in positions of power. But these people who are in these leadership positions, they need to realize that it's not about being the person who everyone needs to love. It's about the people serving for others who depend on you to help make change. And I always say that public service is a relay race. You got to run your best shot, and once you finish, you pass the baton to whoever is next. You can't control what that person does before they hand you the baton, and you can't control what that next person does when you hand them the baton. That is something it seems like we've lost in our political environment nowadays. Nowadays, it just seems like, well, I'm going to go in and I'm going to change every single thing and I'm going to do all these things, yada, yada, yada. That's great. I'm glad that people are aspirational. The problem is when reality starts hitting, then that tune sort of changes. And I just hope that when we think about people like John Hart, we recognize that John Hart might not be recognized by 99.99% of people nowadays. But that doesn't mean that his work and the work of countless other people are going to waste. And this is why we learned history, I believe. It's not just that there are important stories as part of an identity, but it's also a good learning opportunity. And people who may not know what to do now can look back at people who did serve and who did amazing things. And those people might not have known that they were going to do amazing things, but nonetheless, it goes back to the idea of recognizing how we are through history as human beings, not as fictional superheroes. I don't think any of the people I admire in history are superheroes. Every single one of them has flaws. I think, and I believe what makes them a leader is the fact that they recognize that they're human beings. So I hope that we can all be like Honest John, being honest about the fact that we are all human beings. And that's a very, very crucial virtue to hold on to. Lastly, we cannot expect honesty from others if we can't even be honest with ourselves. This is piggybacking off the second point that I just made, but I do think that although so many people want honesty in our politics today, my concern is that people up and down the political environment, from the top leaders all the way down to voters, and I don't mean to say that in a hierarchical sense. I'm just saying the wide range of different people in the political environment. We just seem to not have a grasp on being honest with ourselves, and yet we still expect that we want honesty from our political environment. And I just don't think that honesty is going to come to us if we are not honest with ourselves. It's not just about being honest about the successes, but the honesty about our own failures, our own shortcomings. Going back to that earlier point is recognizing we are human beings. I found this really interesting quote from Cicero. Cicero is one of the most fascinating statesmen from ancient Rome. And he says a number of quotes that I think are critical, but I'm just going to name a few here. I'll start with a funny one. Cicero, I don't know what his sense of humor was, but he probably could have come across as a comedian. There was one quote that says, "Politicians are not born; they are excreted." So I like this little sense of half serious, half humor, but you can see why a lot of people probably feel this way nowadays about politicians. So I can't blame Cicero, although he lived a long, long time ago. There's no question that quote probably resonates with a number of people nowadays. The next quote, though, that I think is a key one is, "What society does to its children, so will its children do to society." Kind of relates a bit to the previous point I made, two points ago, I should say, about the generational gaps, I would say, about public service. And what we don't realize also is that we are not honest with how we look at, even regard our own generations. Society, I think, can be perceived a bit as, people are middle-aged or older. And so I can see why this quote can resonate a lot too, because what we do to our children, what we teach them, all the values, all the things that we teach them, perhaps the things that we don't teach them, those are going to come back. And we may not be able to see exactly, what sort of technologies are going to be around when our children are going to be our age. But we do know that the way we treat other people, especially to our children, I think is going to define how successful our society will be. The last quote is really what I wanted to get to, which is, this is about Caesar. Now, of course, Caesar, as a bit of authoritarian figure, just keep this in mind as we read this quote. Cicero makes a very interesting point about Caesar, though. He says, "Do not blame Caesar. Blame the people of Rome who have so enthusiastically acclaimed and adored him and rejoiced in their loss of freedom and danced in his path and gave him triumphal processions. Blame the people who hail him when he speaks in the form of the, quote, new, wonderful, good society, unquote, which shall now be Rome, interpreted to mean, quote, more money, more ease, more security, more living fatly at the expense of the industrious," unquote. I don't think Cicero was speaking specifically about a political ideology that has a label, for example, like capitalism or socialism. What I do think he's getting to, and it's just my interpretation, but I do think it relates a bit to our discussion so far, which is that we can't just blame the people who are in power, we have to really look at the mirror and say, what are we doing to either facilitate the problems that are happening or to solve the problems that are going on? I don't think we are also having this sort of introspection. When I see that people want to have better politics or they want to have better leaders. In the previous Sacred Honor Series episode about Francis Hopkinson, I mentioned how you can't just have good people in government, you have to have a good system. And branching off from that, you can't just have people who you can't just blame the specific people who are in power. As much as we like to critique them and say the worst things about the people who are opposite of our political ideology, I get that. That's just part of the of politics. I hope people do it more civilly. There's no question about that. But what I'm really getting to is before you critique the president of the United States, how about you imagine how would you have done if you were president of the United States? Have we thought of those questions? Maybe we see that an assemblyman or a senator or so-and-so is not doing a great job, or they fumbled something. And maybe it's true that person really didn't understand what they were doing. And if that is to be the case, then people absolutely should be critiquing these people. But when people are saying that, oh, so-and-so is being divisive, or that they should be appealing to both sides of the aisle, and yet that person is a partisan himself or herself, then what sort of credibility do we have in our society today? So just having, I think, an authentic fabric of political honesty, I think that could really bring about a lot of meaningful change, perhaps more so than any single piece of policy or legislation. What Cicero, I think, is saying here, too, is that there's people who not only are allowing this to happen, but they're actually cheering these people on. See, as much as Caesar, for example, I don't believe that we have a Julius Caesar in the United States right now. I mean, this is, you can't compare apples and oranges here. I'm talking Caesar from someone thousands of years ago. There's almost no comparison to nowadays in terms of one of these elected leaders that you will generally find in the United States. But Caesar is not just someone who just comes out of nowhere. It's the people who are behind him say, yes, you should absolutely go get into this position. We don't recognize that maybe there's people around us. Maybe it's just not the people in power. Maybe it's some of the people around us who, we shouldn't, I think from a political persuasion perspective, we shouldn't demonize other people, but we should recognize that there's other people who have these certain faults, and maybe they should be recognizing that they're partially responsible for some of the problems that are occurring because they put these people in power. And I think the other way can go too, where some people, they distance themselves, saying, "Oh, I didn't have anything to do with this," but perhaps they could have done more to prevent so and so or this kind of ideology from entering a community. So the point is that from Cicero's quote, from this last point I made, I just hope that there's more authentic reflection from voters, from the population, of just people who recognize, there's always ways that we can do better. I don't believe that there's ever going to be a time when myself or anyone is going to say, you know what, I try my best as insert whatever position, that's it for me. No, I don't believe that that's a working democracy. A working democracy should always be about trying to be better than you were yesterday. And when this happens, I say if, I mean when, because societies will make mistakes. When people make mistakes, you pick yourself back up and you realize, okay, everyone makes mistakes. Let's find out ways that we can avoid those mistakes. Cicero actually makes a little bit of a point here. He says, any man can make mistakes, but only an idiot persists in his error. Just goes to show the difference between man and idiot. A man is someone who makes mistakes. An idiot is someone who keeps making those same mistakes. Going back to the honesty element, being honest to ourselves, being honest about who we are, being honest about our intentions, and perhaps the extent to which our actions have consequences, those things I think can improve our society a little bit by bit. It's not going to change overnight. It's not like all of a sudden people are going to be like, oh my gosh, now politics is all good and all pure. It's never going to happen. And I think Cicero also has some things to say about other politicians, but I won't go beyond the first quote that I just cited from him. Having that introspection is going to be important. And John Hart and others in our series show that while they themselves are not perfect, but they themselves were also influenced by the forces that affect how people's lives are run and the fortunes of ordinary people. So by taking these into heart, no pun intended, by the way, by taking these into consideration, I'm confident that we'll be able to get to a point where we are more confident in our democratic process, that we can attract more people to enter public service, and that we can have perhaps a more authentic political environment that we can all cherish for years to come. And with that, thank you all so much for listening to this episode about John Hart. I hope you enjoyed it. Once again, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our show if you haven't already. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. And remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.